There is a story this generation was told about itself, that it grew up in the best era, that it had the freedom of the streets and the promise of the internet, that it inherited a world expanding in every direction at once. And for a while, that story felt true enough to believe. But somewhere between the childhood that ended and the adulthood that arrived, something broke quietly. Not loudly, not visibly, not in a way that could be pointed at and named. It broke the way infrastructure breaks, underneath, slowly without announcement, until one day the weight of ordinary life reveals that the ground was never as solid as it appeared. The loneliness that defines so many people born in the 90s is not the loneliness of isolation. It is not the loneliness of someone who has no one to call. It is something more precise and more confusing than that. It is the loneliness of someone surrounded by contact but deprived of connection. The loneliness of a generation that has more ways to reach other human beings than any generation before it, and yet finds itself in the middle of a normal Tuesday, feeling quietly invisible. To explain that, you have to understand what actually happened. Not the cultural version, not the nostalgic version, but the structural one. This generation occupied a position in history that has never existed before and will never exist again. It was not born into the digital world, and it was not sealed away from it. It grew up analog and matured digital. It learned how to be human in one operating system and was then asked to live in a completely different one, without transition, without preparation, and before it had finished forming. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that governs long-term judgment, social calibration, and emotional regulation, does not fully develop until the mid-20s. The internet did not wait for that development. It arrived during adolescence, exactly the window when the architecture of social identity is still being built. And it rewired the construction site before anything had been finished. What that produced was not a generation addicted to screens. That diagnosis is too shallow and too convenient. What it produced was a generation with atrophied social musculature in very specific areas. Not the ability to charm, not the ability to communicate, but the ability to remain present inside friction. The analog world, with its streets and schoolyards and unmediated arguments, forced a kind of social endurance. You could not simply leave a conversation by tapping a button. You had to negotiate, absorb, misread, and repair in real time. That process was uncomfortable, often painful, and entirely necessary. It built something. Then it stopped being required. The replacement was not connection. The replacement was the simulation of connection delivered at scale. The human nervous system was not designed for the conditions that replaced those streets. It was designed over hundreds of thousands of years to register safety through a very specific set of signals. The sustained eye contact of someone who is genuinely present, the tone of a voice that carries warmth without performance, the proximity of a body that is not curated, not optimized, not broadcasting. These are the biological inputs that release the chemistry of belonging. They are not metaphors. They are physiological requirements. And what the platforms delivered, the notifications, the likes, the replies, the follower counts, resembled those inputs closely enough to activate attention, but not closely enough to satisfy the deeper system. The stimulus arrived. The nourishment did not. This generation was the first to live on that diet long enough for the deficiency to become structural, not a mood, not a phase. A chronic baseline condition in which the sensation of hunger and the sensation of being fed had become difficult to distinguish. Thousands of connections and a persistent sense of not quite belonging to any of them. But the mechanism goes deeper than the biology of social media. There is something else operating underneath the loneliness, something that does not get named because it requires a more uncomfortable admission. This generation was handed a map, a clear, detailed, confident map drawn by the generation before it. Study, work, build steadily. The milestones will arrive in sequence. The institutions will hold. The economy will reward consistency. The social structures your parents navigated will still be standing when you arrive. That map was not offered as a hypothesis. It was offered as a contract. The contract was broken before anyone acknowledged it had expired. The milestones did not arrive in sequence. The economy reorganized around conditions that made the previous contract illegible. The housing market, the labor market, the relationship structures, the timelines, all of it shifted beneath a generation that had been trained to follow a route that no longer existed. And the psychological consequence of that shift was not simply stress or disappointment. The deeper consequence was that the failure felt personal. When your map says you should have arrived somewhere and you have not, the first explanation the mind reaches for is not that the map was wrong. It is that you took a wrong turn, that you are the problem, that something in you is insufficient, that misreading is not weakness. It is what happens when a structural failure is processed through a personal lens that was never given the vocabulary to do otherwise. This is where the loneliness compounds into something more corrosive. Not just the absence of deep connection, not just the metabolic mismatch of digital contact, but the private conviction that the gap between where you are and where you were supposed to be is evidence of a personal deficiency rather than evidence of a broken contract that was never your fault to begin with. And here is where the story changes, because there is something this generation built without realizing it was building anything. The same rupture that created the deficiency also created a capacity. Every person who grew up in two incompatible worlds and was forced to translate between them, who learned the rules of one system and then had to navigate an entirely different one without a guide, who held the dissonance between what was promised and what arrived without collapsing into either denial or despair. That person develops something that cannot be taught in a stable environment. The ability to function without a fixed script. The ability to read a situation that has no precedent. The ability to remain oriented inside conditions that have no reliable map. The generations that preceded the 90s had maps that worked. The generation that followed was born already inside the new terrain and never knew anything different. This generation is the only one that was forced to cross the border consciously, to carry the weight of both worlds simultaneously, and to build its own orientation without institutional permission or reliable precedent. That is not a consolation. It is a structural fact. The path out of the loneliness is not more connectivity. That direction leads back into the same cycle. More stimulus, less nourishment. More contact, less presence. The resolution is more deliberate and less comfortable than that. It requires the intentional reconstruction of the conditions that the digital transition dismantled. Physical presence without performance, relationships measured by depth rather than reach, financial autonomy that removes the dependency on systems still running outdated contracts, and the construction of a personal script that is not inherited but chosen. Not because the inherited one was wrong once, but because it no longer describes the terrain. Most people will not do this, not because they cannot, but because the simulation of connection remains available at all times. And the cost of choosing depth over volume is the willingness to feel the loneliness clearly before it resolves. That is too high a price for most. It requires the kind of tolerance for discomfort that, by strange coincidence, is exactly the capacity this generation was forced to develop. The loneliness was real. The rupture was structural. The map was wrong, not the person holding it. What comes after that recognition is not warmth or relief, it is clarity. And clarity, once it arrives, does not leave room for the old interpretation to return. That is where the pattern breaks. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just precisely and for good.